How you doing, everyone? Today we're going to look at the Boston Massacre of 1770. This is lecture 11 in our course, The Causes of the American Revolution. Last time we looked at Sam Adams's circular letter, or what's also called the Massachusetts Circular Letter, and we identified that the circular letter is very significant into the lead up of the Boston Massacre because it really ties in all the different ideologies and themes that we've covered so far in the American Revolution, such as republicanism, natural rights, the mercantilist policy, standing armies, the monarchy, etc. And all this triggers the Boston Massacre. Um, Today, what we're going to actually do is look at the Boston Massacre specifically, and we're going to analyze the event by using primary source evidence and historical interpretations. So instead of me actually going through what the massacre was, because that is a pretty self-explanatory thing, I'm going to actually introduce to you guys a way of understanding it using primary source evidence. And also we're going to look at this idea of historical interpretations. How do we actually decide on which piece of evidence we use or we treat as more significant than the others? And I'm going to look at three different interpretations of the Boston Massacre. And by doing so, we're building a library of interpretations, but we're also looking at how these specific historians have gone about understanding the massacre itself. If you are looking in your textbook, you can look at page 93 and 96. But I'd also recommend going on my Poplet, which I've put the link to just there on the screen. That is a Poplet or a brainstorm that pretty much gives you a full rundown of the causes of the Boston Massacre. The brainstorm itself is called The Causes of the American Revolution, and you can follow that throughout the rest of the course. But for our means, because I'm not going through the specific causes and consequences of the massacre, you can look at the Poplet to get an understanding. Okay, so the Boston Massacre, I've got two different recallings or retellings of the massacre here. On your left of the screen is the retelling of the Boston Massacre from Commander Thomas Gage, the British commander who's based in America. And we've got on the right, the retelling of the Boston Massacre from Samuel Adams, who, as we know, is a radical patriot of the Americans, propagandist of the Americans. And instead of reading through it all, I've pretty much color-coded it for you guys to understand or identify where these accounts line up and where these accounts differ. So in the blue is every time that both Gage and Adams actually say the same thing, which is unique because we've got two real different perspectives or motivations in the retelling. First of all, we got Gage, who is a loyalist to the empire and so is trying to justify why the massacre took place and why the shootings occurred in defense of the British soldiers. And we've got Adams, who is completely against the British soldiers and is trying to point out how horrible a massacre this is because of the British, pretty much. So as we can see on the screen there, and you guys, I would suggest pausing the video here and actually just reading through the two accounts. But as you can see, both retellings, it's about 50-50 similar and 50-50 different. Both men identify that there was a bell that was ringing, and when everyone came out into the town of Boston, they assumed that there was a fire because the bell was ringing. But then they differ in, who was attacked first, the mob or the sentry. Gage says that the sentry was attacked by the mob, and Adams says that the sentry knocked down a boy, and therefore the mob was attacked first, provoking what would later on become the massacre. We've also got different accounts of, how many people were there and what kind of type of people were there. So Gage says that there were different mobs parading through the streets, whereas Adams says that there were many different types of people within those mobs. There were some cooler ones, who were advised to go home. There were curious ones, and then there were ones that actually, agreed with the resentment that the boy expressed after being knocked down by the guard. And also, just on that, we have a similarity in the fact that both Gage and Adams acknowledge the fact that the sentry ended up loading his gun, but for different motivations. Gage says that the sentry loaded his gun out of defense, whereas Adams says that the sentry loaded his gun in an offensive against the mob. So already we can see that these similarities and differences are important to acknowledge in the two tellings of the Boston Massacre. We got Gage heavily in defense of the sentry and the fact that the mob attacked the sentry, and that the sentry who was positioned at the customs house loaded his gun out of defense because he was being attacked, whereas Adams is saying the sentry was the first person to provoke the boy, and he then loaded his gun to attack the mob that would eventually surround him after attacking the boy in the first place. And then we've got the rest of the retelling, which again is Gage in the green, recalling how the actual massacre took place, and likewise Adams recalling how the massacre took place in the red, and whether or not this is an attack or a standoff, whether or not Gage is correct in saying that the mob attacked whether or not the mob attacked the sentry and the 12 men that were sent by Captain Preston, or whether or not this was actually a standoff. And both Adams and Gage say that there was an attack, but it could also be assumed that there was a standoff between the two, and it's difficult to actually understand from or identify from these two retellings of the Boston Massacre, whether or not the who was at fault or who was to blame here. Was it really in defense, or was it an offensive by the sentries who were standing at the customs house? And I've identified the fact that the missing link in this whole thing, in both of these retellings, is Captain Preston, the guy that was actually giving the orders and was there at the scene at the time, because Adams and Gage both weren't present at the scene. So this is a really good opportunity for us to actually acknowledge the fact that it's important for us to question the motivations of primary source text. And as I've pointed here, we should seek out the actual retelling of the Boston Massacre from Captain Preston's point of view, because as Gage says, he introduces the fact that Preston is there, whereas Adams doesn't recognize Preston at all. And so we have to chase Captain Preston's actual recollection or account of the Boston Massacre to get maybe a third opinion. Now, the risk we run is that we know that Captain Preston is in defense of the British, so we might read this and find that he's also just in defense of the British, but it may be a more reliable source because he was there and he was giving the orders. So with that, here's Captain Preston's account. And again, I'm not going to read through this all. Take your time to read through it by pausing it. But I've just highlighted in purple the crucial bits. It says, Captain Preston, I saw the people in great commotion. So we already know that he's there, right? He was there. I saw the people in great commotion and heard them use the most cruel and horrid threats against the troops. In a few minutes after I reached the guard, about 100 people passed it and went towards the custom house, where the king's money is lodged. They immediately surrounded the sentry posted there, and with clubs and other weapons threatened to execute their vengeance on him. I was soon informed by a townsman their intention was to carry off the soldier from his post and probably murder him. So, this is very much alike Gage's account. It is defending the sentry. It is making it out to be the case that the Boston mob is attacking the troops. But in comparison to both Gage and Adams, we can at least say that Captain Preston was there. And he's the one who's getting first-hand accounts of the Boston Massacre actually taking place. So already, whilst Gage and Adams give us good context of what's going on, because we have two differing opinions, Preston's account so far is actually the one that we should be listening to the most. Going on, he says, very soon followed myself to prevent, if possible, all disorder, fearing lest the officer and soldiers, by the insults and provocations of the rioters, should be thrown off their guard and commit some rash act. So he's pretty much saying there that when he arrived to the scene, his intention was to calm both the soldiers and the mob, the Boston mob, to make sure that no rash act was committed. Unfortunately, that doesn't occur because the Boston Massacre actually happens, but it's an interesting insight into Captain Preston's mind. He's actually gone in acknowledging the fact that it was a very tense moment. Both officers and the mob were facing off against one another. And so what Captain Preston does, it actually brings together both the accounts of Gage and Adams that we've seen in these two slides. All right. We both see both of these accounts against one another, and we've read Preston, and he's actually synthesized this and said both accounts are actually relatively truthful. And what my role was to come in and stand in the middle. So if we look at these two accounts, really, if we can imagine that Preston's actually sitting in the middle here. We've got Gage barracking for the British, we've got Adams barracking for the Americans, and then we've got Preston, who comes and sits in the middle and tries to negotiate both parties, right? So he comes in and to prevent, if possible, all disorder. Continuing. On this, a general attack was made on the men by a great number of heavy clubs and snowballs being thrown at them, by which all our lives were in imminent danger, some persons at the same time from being behind calling out, "Damn your bloods, why don't you fire?" That's really I've highlighted that in green because that is what Gage also says about what's going on at the Boston Massacre. And then Preston adds on to this, including his first-hand account of what ends up taking place. And pretty much, in short, Boston civilians, American colonists, end up getting shot, and there is a big commotion as to why they're getting shot. When the Americans shout fire, why don't you fire? The British then fire on the mob, thinking that Preston is saying that that they should fire, etc., etc. And down the bottom it says, this might be the case as many of the mob called out fire, fire, but I assured the men that I gave no such order, that my words were, don't fire, stop your firing. In short, it was scarcely possible for the soldiers to know who said fire or don't fire or stop your firing. So he's not saying that what happened was a good thing. However, he's justifying why the soldiers fired their guns on the mob in the first place, and pretty much justifying it to alleviate any guilt on behalf of the British Empire, and saying, look, this was just a freak accident. It shouldn't have occurred. I tried to stop it. Both sides were heated. And as soon as the mob provoked the British by saying, why don't you fire? They heard fire thinking it was me, Preston, and they started firing. And I shouted, stop firing, but they didn't. And they didn't know where that order was coming from. So those are our two accounts. We got Gage, Preston, and Adams, all with differing accounts. However, Preston really cements or synthesizes both Gage and Adams's accounts and helps us understand what happens in the Boston Massacre. These are our historical interpretations. So I've given you three historians here who have differing opinions on the Boston Massacre itself. We've got Jim Champagne in the top saying Captain Thomas Preston's account of the massacre is the only official report on the events of the 5th of March 1770. So Champagne is pretty much arguing here that, we can't take what Gage said, we can't take what Adams said. We actually have to go to the person who was there at the time. And that was Thomas Preston. And whatever Thomas Preston says, we have to have faith that he's telling the truth, and he's got the right idea in communicating both sides of the story. By taking that, we have to think, well, maybe Gage's account is probably more truthful than Adams, because Gage gets his information from Preston. So this is a perspective. It's a very literal perspective, a very logical perspective, and historical interpretation by Champagne, saying, we've got all these competing theories and narratives about the massacre, but we just have to go to the one guy who was there at the time. Now, this also begs the question, well, what about all the other bystanders that were watching the massacre? Couldn't we trust their account too? And so that is where we have to challenge Champagne's interpretation here, that Preston's account is the only official report and thus must be the most truthful or most reliable source. So we have to challenge that. But he does have a point here. James Bowdoin in Bernard Bailyn says the massacre was the logical work of a standing army. So that's a very Adams-like thing to say. The massacre was the logical work of a standing army. We know that by saying standing army, he's talking about the British customs duty officers that were there at the time, such as Thomas Preston. And so what Bowdoin is pretty much saying here is, the massacre was almost irresistible. It was always going to occur. And it was always going to occur because the standing army was present in Boston at the time anyway. So, it was always going to eventually and logically, the massacre was always going to eventually occur. In other words, if we think about it logically, of course the massacre is going to occur because the standing armies are there. There's great resentment for the standing army. Taxation is very present. We've got the circular letter. We've got the letter from a farmer from John Dickinson, etc. And so the fact that there is heat or a divide between the mob and the British army, that's a logical thing to say. And so obviously the massacre was going to occur. And finally, we've got Joanne Freeman, who says, so you can really see from these two accounts, and she's specifically talking about Gage and Adams, okay? So you can really see from these two accounts and from the details contained within them, the animosity and the sense of alienation between the colonists and the soldiers on both sides. And you can also see really dramatically the fears on both sides that there's some kind of plot. There's some kind of plot of resistance or tyranny, depending on which side you're on. Somehow this is organized and it's not good, and it has to be stopped. And both sides have come to that same point. And so Freeman is really acting like Preston, I guess, in trying to synthesize both points. The idea that Gage thinks that there is some kind of plot of resistance, and Adams thinks that there's some kind of plot of tyranny. And Preston, with his account, pretty much says, yeah, both plots kind of make sense. However, I was the one who was giving the orders, and I can say that there was no tyranny. There was just this motivation to try and calm everything down. Unfortunately, things got out of control, and I guess these plots of resistance and tyranny really sparked or motivated both sides to actually attack one another. And that's how Freeman argues that they both came to the same point, that both Gage and Adams, or the British and the Americans, both think that there is some kind of plot driving both sides to actually act in the way that they did at the Boston Massacre. So these are our three historical interpretations. One that's really supportive of Preston and Gage, one that's really supportive of Adams, and then one that's supportive of both. And I guess it's up to you guys in deciding which one you would take sides on, and which one is the most which interpretation you believe the most. And I guess that also comes down to which interpretation of the story from our primary evidence you believe the most too. There's also many other depictions of the Boston Massacre, which I would definitely recommend having a look at and studying. As you can see, there's 4 different interpretations of the massacre there too. Not necessarily from anyone that was physically there. And I'm not going to go into very much detail at all here, but as you can see on the left of the screen, there's one that's shooting the Americans the British are shooting the Americans very clearly. In top right, you can see that it's a very even attack. In the bottom left, also a very even attack, and then kind of in the center, the smallest one there, it looks like the Americans are attacking the British. So there's no real clear-cut way of understanding the Boston Massacre. Now, I guess that's the point here. But what I wanted you guys to think about is, how do we actually understand this? What is the narrative? What's the honest narrative? And where do we get our facts from? Okay, so that's it for the Boston Massacre. We're going to look at the aftermath of the Boston Massacre next time, looking at the Townshend duties. How Townshend dies. We've already looked at Townshend duties. How Townshend dies, the T-Tax, the Gaspé, and the committees of correspondence. And those lectures are going to pretty much set us up for what's called the Boston Tea Party. If you've got any questions, please post them on the Google Classroom or see me in class. And please, as I said, look back at those images that I've just shown you on the previous slide and try to interpret what occurs at the Boston Massacre for yourself. Come up with your own evaluation of the narrative of the Boston Massacre.